His stool looked more like a throne the way he sat on it, and he kept throwing them back to the general rapture of the onlookers. He was middle-aged, late 40s by his look, and his body was beginning to run into the zone of comfortable fat that seemed the providence of men on the cusp of old age. He'd come here every night for the last week, and for the last week, I'd come here to observe him. I knew his name, which was a rarity. Most of them were just part of the faceless mass. Some of them would remain faceless forever, but some of them were known to me before the end. I was their shadow, the one who knew their secrets, and the one who ushered them from life to death. At that moment, I remembered my first. They say you never forget your first, and I can assure you that's the case. How could I forget her? She ushered me into the world of the living, so it was only fair that I usher her into the world of the dead. My mother was not what you would call a loving woman. My father left shortly after my birth, and my mother became a hateful, gin-soaked creature who lived to work, drink, and remind me of how worthless I was. I must thank her one day. She made me into the man I am. All those years of being told how I was garbage, the waste of space, and now I'd never amount to anything, had crafted me into a humble target for her to hurl her rage at, until that one night when I'd finally had enough. She was dying. That was plain enough to see. It was a close race between the booze and the smokes to see who could come out on top. The arthritis was making a nuisance of itself as usual, and as I cut her meat, she continued to pick at my subconscious like a junkie picking at scabs. The meat wasn't cut small enough. Now it was cut too small. It was a funny shape, and what could she expect from a worthless pile of shit like me after all? She was ashamed of her weak, servile son, and if there was any justice in this world. But you know, I never found out what would happen if there was any justice in this world. At that moment, I had suffered all I meant to. I yelled for her to shut up, and I stuck the knife I'd been using to cut her meat into her chest. She looked up at me, and her eyes were so full of terror and wonder that I put the knife back in again. I'd stabbed her 5 times before she made a sound, and even that was unintelligible. A gurgling, incoherent sound that befit a formless hag like my mother, hand in glove. I moved her body and told the police she had come home drunk and attacked me. They let me collect her estate, such as it was, and I moved on. The only thing worthwhile that I ever had from her was the knowledge that I was good for at least one thing. He got up from the stool, and I tensed as I came out of my memories. He took a step for the door, but then changed his mind and walked to the bathroom instead. I settled myself and waved the waitress away when she starts to check on me. This was not the dying place I had planned for him, but I could feel his time getting close. I used the money I'd gotten from my mother's estates to travel. When I say travel, you probably think of planes or buses, but my mother's estate had mostly come in unpaid bills. $50 in a savings account, another $500 she'd hidden in the bookcase and forgotten about, and $1,500 in a life insurance policy I'd never known existed. I sold all the possessions she had left her debts unsettled, and melted into the exciting world of public vagrancy. I rode the rails, slept under bridges, and all the time I kept honing my craft. I killed a bum in New York that was found in a river later, his pockets holding $500 and a dirty picture of a woman. Then I found a junkie in Jersey, who I later found out had a wife and kids he'd been hiding his drug problem from. Then 2 prostitutes in Queens who had been sharing the same man without knowing it, and all the while me staying one step ahead of the authorities. The investigations weren't lengthy. These were street people, or people up to no good, and their investigations were forgettable. The one to matter since my mother was number 5. Number 5, we'll call him James, was a New York businessman with a dark secret than the money he laundered from the mob. I was back home for the first time in years when I bumped into James purely by mistake. Coming out of a bus station, he plowed into me on the sidewalk and barked at me to look where the hell I was going. Some people would have killed him right then and there, but that wasn't my way. The stalk was the biggest thrill for me. Soon I discovered that James had a little secret of his own. He used to pick up whores late at night in his fancy red sports car. He liked to take them to the docks, and after a little backseat back and forth, he would drug them and sell them to people who knew who would pay top dollar for good stock. These weren't mobsters either. These were men who could afford to make sure these women disappeared. Afterwards, he'd get high in his car and zone out as he thought his bleak thoughts had mellowed. He'd come back to reality pretty quick when I slid the knife across his throat. His eyes rolled up as I told him how bad he'd been as his life dribbled out down his cheap suit. The police found enough evidence in his briefcase to follow the paper trail, but I was long gone by then. My latest quarry returned from the bathroom and staggered towards the door again. After bumping into a few tables and accepting the scornful shouts and hard shoves from the patrons, he found the door and wrapped his hand around the handle. I started to rise, and then his friends called to him from the door, offering him just one more for the road. "Well, how can I say no to such a generous offer?" he asked, and wandered back to the bar for one more drink. Killing this one would be doing him a favor, just like number 18. Number 18. Anna had been sweet enough to make me think about giving it all up and living a normal life. Too bad life is rarely that easy. During my travels, I caught pneumonia and was hospitalized for nearly a week. Anna was my nurse. She was the sweetest person I'd ever met, and after bringing me back from the brink of death, she found out I was homeless and wandering and invited me to stay with her until I could get back on my feet. I stayed with her for nearly a year, and the two of us became closer than we'd expected. In that year, I never once felt the urge to kill. We'd been planning our wedding when they diagnosed her with cancer. As she underwent chemotherapy, tried new diet after miracle cure, after experimental treatment, I went back to my old respite. That year, Chicago was hit by a serial killer. 9 victims in 9 months, but my 10th victim was the only one that mattered. On her deathbed, Anna told me she knew I was the killer. She'd followed me one night, putting her own health at risk. She said she had been certain I wasn't cheating on her. She saw me stab a man and push him into the canal. She was tired of living, tired of the pain, and she asked me to be her mercy angel. I gave her what she wanted. By the time the air bubble in her IV killed her, I was already gone. One for the road turned out to be more like 5. When my prey finally shuffled towards the door, I was there to hold it open for him. He thanked me in a slurry voice and stumbled out into the night, the king of the inebriates. I followed after him like a hungry wraith, and when he turned down an alley, I knew his time had come. I tucked my knife up in my sleeve and began to creep up behind him as I moved to the end of the alley. I heard his zipper go down, and as he sent a stream of piss arcing across the bricks, I stalked in quietly behind him. North Carolina was not my desired destination, but I'd enjoyed the 3 years I'd been here. After Anna, I was drunk more than I was sober. Beer when I had money, hobo brew when I didn't, and always I rode the rails from one place to another. I picked up work in Maine and drank my way to Philadelphia, sloshed my way back to Chicago, where I somehow drank my way into a drunk tank in Warren, North Carolina. After my release, I worked odd jobs for odd folks. I landed a steady gig as a day cook in a little greasy spoon diner, and only felt the urge to kill a few times. The people in Warren were good people, and the people I killed were bad people, people who had tainted that image. A rapist I knew from my days on the rails who blew into town and started doing his own stalking. A foul-mouthed drunk who kept driving after they took his license. A woman with a taste for married men. And finally, Mr. Ham here, number 23. Mr. Ham, though, he was the worst of the bunch. He hated the homeless with a passion, and I suspected that he had killed some of my fellow rail riders for imagined crimes. I had watched him for a week, marked his movements carefully, and now it was time to see him put away for good. I raised the knife as I came up behind him and prepared for the strike that would take him while he urinated. That's when he turned, and his arc of piss hit me full in the face. I stumbled backwards, momentarily blinded, and a solid blow took me to my knees. I toppled, legs hurting, and a heavy right struck me in the chest as I flailed to get back up. I wiped at my eyes, and there was Ham, towering over me. He was no longer looking quite so drunk. Perched on my chest like the world's ugliest gargoyle, he smiled down at me, looking like the cat that finally got the cream. "I knew you were watching me all this time, so I thought I'd see what your intentions were. I suspected you were trying to kill me. Kind calls to kind, after all. But I do have one question before I kill you." The tip of my own knife pressed against my throat. "How many lives have you counted?" I didn't have to ask what he meant. You would have been 23. He leaned in, wishing to impart a secret before the end, and whispered, "You will be my 44th.
Have you ever heard the sound a scalpel makes as it slides over bone? If you haven't, it's a little like a knife scraping over a hollow rock. The bone isn't as solid as you might think, not as solid as the blade at least, and the sound has an eerie quality to it. The more I reflect on the sound, the more it reminds me of nails on a chalkboard or sidewalk chalk that kids drag over pavement. It's a weird noise that sets your hair on edge, makes you grit your teeth against the intrusive grinding. I've had a lot of time to think about that sound in the years following my wife's death. That was the sound that woke me up that night. It had been a long week. The department had been reeling over a series of brutal murders, and this was the first night I'd gotten to sleep in my own bed. I had been crashing in the break room, sleeping in my car, living one cup of coffee at a time while we tried to catch this sadistic son of a bitch. I know many cops in the same situation, but as most of us are locals, the desire to see this guy brought to justice was palpable. The killer had been sticking to a specific area. My area, actually. He was killing with no pattern, no particular demographic, but he seemed to be sticking to victims in this particular part of town. They were low to middle income families, people who couldn't just afford to up and leave because a crazy killer was on the loose, no matter how heinous the crimes were. And the crimes were particularly heinous. 7 different victims, none of them having anything in common, had been found with their faces skinned down to the bone and removed. The whole face. It was as though someone had cut the face off, skinned it to the skull, and took it with them when they left. Nothing was ever taken from the apartments. No messages were left. The killer never lingered after doing their strange deed. We called him a killer, but the victims were usually still alive when he left. They died from blood loss afterwards, sometimes living for hours, lying there as they watched their life leak away and screamed wetly. The last one was a store owner, well liked in the community too. The one before that was an 80-year-old grandmother. Before that it was a 19-year-old girl who was popular with the boys in the neighborhood. A bike messenger, a beat cop, an aspiring actress, a high school student who was once a beauty queen. None of these people had even known each other. There was no connection between them except for where they lived, and no one could find a single person that any of them knew in common. The only connection seemed to be that they were all well liked. I had been sent home that night, Captain telling me that I looked like crap and I needed to sleep in a real bed. My wife had been waiting for me. Captain Weems may have called her before I left, and the night had been a good one. She had saved me some dinner, roast, potatoes, things I liked, and we had cuddled on the couch as we watched something on Netflix. As tired as I was, I remember feeling warm just the same as I spent the night with her. When she looked up at me, her head pillowed in my lap, I remember thinking I was the luckiest guy in the world. When I fell asleep after a rather heated session of lovemaking, I found myself looking forward to the next day, hoping that we could catch this guy and get rid of some of the fear that was hanging around like a cloud. When I came awake, it was because of the scraping noise. Some nights, I wish I had just stayed asleep. I lay awake for a few seconds, listening to the scraping sound and wondering what it could be. It was such an alien noise, like a nail dragged across a window. There was an underlying sound as well, a low, muffled sound, like someone having a bad dream. I rolled on my side, thinking my wife was having a nightmare or something, and wanting to comfort her. She was prone to nightmares. Her childhood had been less than ideal, and I wanted to wrap her in my reassuring arms. I found myself unable to move, though. My whole body was heavy, my muscles unresponsive, and all I could do was lie there and listen to her soft groans and husky moans. I was trying to move, but this was different than the usual sleep paralysis somehow. This felt like being out of my body, unable to control it. Then my eyes tracked to the mirror that sat atop my wife's vanity, and I felt a scream hang in my throat like a piece of meat. I was choking on the scream, as my mind tried to process what I was seeing. It was a dream. It had to be. Things like this didn't exist in the real world. This was a nightmare. Maybe I was even the one making these noises that I was hearing. This simply couldn't be happening. I was dreaming. I was nightmaring. I would wake up. This would all go away. The longer it went on, though, the more I concluded that it had to be happening. The thing reflected in the mirror was nearly 7 feet tall. It crouched in the bedroom, leaning over my wife, as it slid one long finger over her face. Its head was large, like a big gray baby doll head, with the face covered by a grotesque mask that looked plastered on. There was a spread of red around the mask's corners, and it looked stretched and frayed as it lay pancaked across the creature's face. The creature's body was gray, long and disproportionately slim, on a pair of spindly legs that disappeared below the corner of the bed. What interested me most, however, were the long gray arms that ended in pointy fingers. Fingers he was currently sliding over my wife's face. He was tracing that long finger along the same track, again and again, and I could just see a trickle of blood sliding down one of her cheeks as I watched helplessly. I could see a trench working its way through the skin, the blood beginning to run more freely as he went. His eyes, his overly expressive blue eyes, followed the finger's path as he worked, and I tried with all I had to break out of whatever held me. The too big head looked up from its work, and I realized I was shaking a bit as I watched him. His hand stretched out, impossibly long, and one of those claws came to rest in my ear. It was cold and wet, like a fish that's been plucked from a stream. Suddenly, my shuddering stopped, and I realized why I couldn't move. This thing had done something to me, had done something to my wife. I was forced to lay there and watch as he went about his work. The process was not quick. Whatever tool he had at the end of his wrist was dull indeed. He had to make the circuit for nearly an hour and a half, and my wife's muffled cries were beginning to become more pitiful. The blood was really coming down now, pooling on the bed and turning the white sheet a deep red. I saw my wife starting to shudder, thinking she might come out of it. He touched her with one of those claws, though, putting the tip in her ear, and she went still again. I was going to have to watch as he took her face off. At some point, I think I realized that. All the realizing in the world, though, wouldn't prepare me for it. Finally, after what felt like days, he pulled the finger back and bent over her. He brought both hands up, 10 scalpel fingers peeling the face I had loved so much from her too white skull. That's the other sound I'll never forget. The sound of my wife's face being peeled away sounds like nothing so much as Velcro separating. I saw it in the murky glass as it came free. For just an instant, I could see the creature's face too. It pulled off the old mask, and I realized too late that it was the face of the shopkeeper we had found a few days ago. It put the face in its mouth, and as it chewed, I could see a face like a swollen potato, its mouth like a carved jack-o'-lantern sneer. Its rubbery teeth chewed at the flesh as those eyes stared blankly into space. It had a pair of way too expressive blue eyes, and for a moment I thought they might have come from a doll. They looked at me suddenly, locked mine as I stared into the mirror. Those horrible blue eyes held my gaze for a count of 20 before it slapped the new face on with a wet chuck sound. Those eyes stared back at me through the eye holes of my wife's detached face, and the creature went out through the window without a second look. Those eyes peeking jealously out of my wife's face were the worst part, and that face haunts my dreams every night. By the time I could move, she was already dead. She came out of it before I did, though. She lay on the bed, gasping wetly and calling for me. I didn't know if she could see me. Did her eyes still work? She passed out a few times as she tried to turn her head, finally just laying in her own blood and calling for me softly. She wanted me to save her, wanted me to wake her up from this nightmare. She couldn't be dying in her own bed after having her face cut off. I began to get some feeling back in my arms as her voice trailed away. I could flex my fingers, but my arms didn't seem to want to work until after she had already slipped off. The light had begun to peek in by that time, and I fell out of bed as I scrambled for the phone. I told them everything. I told them about the creature. I told them about its long claws. I told them about the paralyzing dread. I told them how it had taken my wife's face and left out the window. Their response was to send me to a therapist, to give me time to grieve, to have me work with a hypnotherapist to try to decide if I had actually seen something. I quickly learned that they didn't want to believe what I had seen. They wanted to believe that I had created this monster from my trauma. They wanted me to believe it too, but I wouldn't. I suffered through the bereavement period. I went to the therapists and told them what they wanted to hear. They wanted to tell me that the creature was a way for my mind to cope with what had happened. I knew better, though. I used that downtime to gain information about the creature. There wasn't much to go on. The crimes had all been committed within 2 blocks of each other, all in a central location, all in the part of town that housed several large apartment complexes. I asked around, seeing if anyone had seen anything like it, but I got very few answers. Some of the homeless people told me that they had seen something skulking about lately, but most of them were too strung out to be credible. A few of them led me to an abandoned underground station that had once been central to the area, but now stood abandoned. The homeless didn't stay there anymore, and if they did, they stayed there forever, or so they told me. After a month of bereavement, I came back with the information I had compiled. I was ready to hand it to the chief, but I returned to a very different environment. No one believed that I'd seen a monster steal my wife's face. I began to hear rumbles around the station that I was a suspect now. A 15-year officer had just laid there and watched his wife have her face taken off. Not likely. Seemed more likely that I had been out all night and come home to find her like that. It seemed more likely still that I was the killer, banking on the idea that my reputation would put me above suspicion. I didn't care. I knew what I'd seen, and I took my information straight to my boss. My boss, however, was in another camp altogether. Is this how you spend your period of mourning? I want you fresh, all this monster stuff out of your system. The others, they already think you're unhinged. The ones who don't think it, think you're the killer. You need to be careful talking about this kind of crap around here. Get back to your desk. You're on light duty until further notice. I don't want another word about this damn monster. I seethed behind my desk, already planning my next move. If it was proof they wanted, then it was proof I'd give them. I left early that morning and went to my home to prepare. I packed a bag, took my service pistol, and a shotgun from the hall closet. The little pump action fit nicely in my camp sack, as well as a rope, a flashlight, and some trail bars. I dressed warmly. The November weather was already becoming frigid after dark, and I looked back at my apartment before leaving, unsure if I'd ever see it again. I glanced at my wife's portrait on the mantel, though, and it was enough to send me on my way. This creature wouldn't be wearing her face for long. The old underground was a dilapidated relic, a toothless mouth that gaped out of the pavement. The gate was locked, but I had been told the fence was cut around the back. Some industrious vag had made a neat little hole to scurry through, and I entered the perimeter without much fuss. The sun had begun to set as I flipped on the flashlight, and it cast a red glow across the grimy tiles. The glow was gone after the second staircase, and I was plunged into true darkness. The outside had looked bad, but the inside was a ruin. The tiles had been shattered in places, light fixtures hanging from a leaky roof, and a single train stood like a hulk on a dead track. There was a constant sound of dripping water, a constant sound of scurrying feet, and it was easy to imagine that this was what Bilbo Baggins had found under the Goblin Mountain. I found myself swinging my flashlight around at every sound, my years of cool police training melting away as I descended into the station. Near the tracks, I found a handprint that looked red with dried blood. I jumped down to the tracks without a second thought, drawing my gun and looking right and left. My light fell across a fainted smear going left, light red staining the side of the train. I decided that was my direction. I moved quietly, not wanting to tip my prey off. He could have been hanging over my head for all I knew. If he lived here, he could probably see in the dark, and bringing a beacon with me would be as good as screaming down the tunnel. As I moved, I had little doubt that he knew I was here. The deeper in I went, the worse the scuttling and the skittering became. I told myself it was rats, but how sure was I of that? How sure was I that the scrabbling I heard wasn't the sound of those sharp fingers scraping across the ceiling? How sure was I that that scrabbling was the sound of those equally long toes, toes that I had never seen, gripping the pavement and moving his body along in a quiet scuttle? As I took another corner, I could swear that something big moved just out of my flashlight beam. I held it there for a count of 20 before turning away and continuing down the tunnel. The blood smears were all gone now, but I felt drawn deeper in as I took turns at random. It was almost as if I could hear my wife's voice calling me, and I had little doubt that he knew I was there now. I had even less doubt when he fell on my back, slamming my head down on the floor and sending my gun spinning out of my hand. I blacked out, and when I came to, I really wished I had died. I was laid across a metal bench somewhere deep in the tunnel. An eerie light lit the space, some kind of plant life maybe, and I found that I was paralyzed again. That was when my wife's face, a face made terrible by those two expressive eyes, loomed over me, and I'd have cringed away if I'd been able to move at all. It studied me, maybe it even recognized me, but its regard was terrible as it came from a face I had loved so much. Her face was decomposed, rotting away as it clung to the creature's skull, and I felt something goopy fall onto my cheek as he leaned close to inspect me. I had only thought it couldn't get any worse. That was when he pressed that finger to the cleft in my chin. He began to circle, the claw digging against my skin as he slid the nail around and around and around my face. It didn't hurt at first. At first, it was little more than a discomfort, and I began to wonder how long he had been carving at my wife before I woke up. I stared at him, and he stared back, those baby blue eyes boring into me. His eyes were mesmerizing, terrifying, as they held unwaveringly still. As the minutes stretched into hours, I began to feel my face heating up. It was subtle at first, just a little warmth around my chin and forehead, but as the circling finger went round and round and round, I felt like someone was holding a lighter on my skin. I would have screamed, my flesh becoming seared, but I couldn't move, and my horror was trapped in my throat. I started to feel the blood as it slid down my cheek. First, it was just a trickle, a damp line or two, but soon it ran in rivulets. Soon I could feel my flesh parting from my skull. Soon I could feel that sizzling heat as it cut my skin, and I felt as though I might pass out. I had to. I must black out from this shock. There was no way that everyone was awake as he cut their living face from their body. It was impossible. It was sick. It was... He pulled the finger back suddenly, and I realized with real horror what was about to happen. All 10 fingers gripped my flesh, and I tried to pull away. Maybe I could still make it to a hospital. They could fix me. They could make this right. There was no way he was going to take my face. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. It wasn't supposed to... He gripped my face, and I heard that same Velcro ripping as my own skin came free of my skull. Then he devoured my wife's face as I watched, and slapped my own across the gore-soaked canvas that was his lumpy head. He hooted then. Hooted and cried in a strange, unknowable language. He turned to a deeper tunnel and cried out in pure pleasure as he fulfilled whatever ritual he was performing, whatever dark spell he needed these faces for. I hoped he would let me go now. I had lost a lot of blood, but maybe I could still get some medical attention. I felt groggy, but when I heard something struggling out of the depths of the tunnel, I felt something heavy settle into my guts. What fresh hell was this? Out of the darkness, lit only by whatever phosphorescence dwelled down here, came a hulking thing that slid on long gray limbs. It was spider-like, a massive gray blob that pulled itself along on something like tentacles. Each of them ended in the same hooked fingers as the creature. It lowered its equally mushy face to the creature, taking in the face he now wore, and I heard something speak in a voice made of broken glass. "Do's it please, oo mother? Do I please, oo mother?" it cried, and that voice was full of hope and terrible longing. The gray creature leaned in, seemed to contemplate for a long moment, before it opened its shapeless mouth and whispered a single horrible word in a language like snakes crawling across my naked face. "Ugly." Then it pulled itself back into the depths, and I heard the creature sobbing as it fell to its gray knees and wept. Then, suddenly I was running. My mind had set itself to autopilot, and my body and mind just couldn't take it anymore. Myself pushed against this thing in its terrible need, and my body propelled itself away before this knowledge could do my brain lasting harm. I ran and ran, blind in that lightless world, as the blood leaked down my naked face. If the creature came after me, then I never knew. If the thing that wore my face came after me, I never knew. I was running one second, the darkness pressing in all around me, and the next my world was full of light, and I was falling into oblivion. The next thing I knew, I was in the hospital, being told just how lucky I was to be alive. An undercover cop had followed me to the underground entrance, and had waited to question me when I came back out. When I didn't come out for several hours, he called in people to look for me. Those people had heard me screaming through the tunnels, caught sight of my faceless form in their flashlights, and caught me just before I fell. I had nearly died on the way here. I had simply lost too much blood, and my body was in some kind of shock. They had sedated me, my night terrors causing me to buck and scream, and I had spent nearly a week in the hospital bed. No one thinks I'm crazy anymore. No one thinks I'm the killer anymore. Certainly, no one believes I cut my own damn face off. I'm writing this as a warning to anyone living in the area. Get out. Leave your home, and get out. The creature has no rhyme or reason for his actions. He seeks only to gain something that I believe he will never find. I'm safe now, a faceless horror who will have to live his life with the knowledge I discovered under the city that day. But you needn't suffer my fate. Get away from the Cheapside. Get away from the concrete apartments. Get as far from the city as you can, lest you be one more face for this monster to show his mother. "Daddy, look at the picture I drew." I put on my best appraising my son's artwork face and looked down at the picture he had drawn. I recoiled a little when I saw it, not really sure what to make of it. It was a baby head, like a baby doll, but no body was attached to it. The hair was gone, nothing but dots on the scalp, and the eyes were missing and staring openly. A big silver loop like a smile ran through the head, and the bottom was covered with little metal spider legs. I looked at it for a few minutes, wondering what this horrible thing was, but suddenly it came to me, and I felt silly for being so anxious. "Good job, buddy. It's the spider baby from Toy Story, right?" I said, handing it back to him. "No, Daddy, it's the monster that comes to my window at night." I sighed audibly. The monster had become a point of contention in our house as of late. Every night for the past 3 weeks, my son had woken up screaming because there was a monster outside his window. Ever since we had moved into our new house, it had been a regular nightly event, and I had almost started waking up before the screaming started. It never mattered how fast I ran, though. There was never anything there when I arrived. He was always sitting in his bed, pointing out the window and crying about a monster looking in at him. When we got home, he grabbed his tablet and began to watch Mickey Mouse Clubhouse, as he was wont to do after school. I made sure he was comfortable on the couch and not likely to run out the front door as I started washing dishes. Between the three of us, we usually make a fair amount of dishes. I was just finishing up when my wife came home, grimacing at the picture on the fridge as she came in. "That's an interesting piece of artwork," she said, kissing me on the cheek. "Apparently, that's the monster that's been waking him up every night," I said, making her frown as she sat at the table. "Ugh, the monster again. This has to stop. We have to do something." I shrugged, tossing the drying rag into the sink. "I wish I knew what. What if you spent the night in there tonight?" I looked dubiously at her. "What, like on the floor or something?" "No, you could sleep in the other bed in there." I always forget there are 2 beds in my son's room. They were bunk beds, one on the ground level and one on the top. One was supposed to be for guests, playmates, or cousins who wanted to spend the night. The other was for him. In reality, though, it was more of an excuse for my son to pick a bed to sleep in every night. He usually slept on the top bunk, sitting right beneath the window, but sometimes he liked to sleep on the smaller bed at the floor level. "Okay, I guess I'll spend the night in there. Promise you'll reward me in the morning?" I teased. She said she would and giggled when I kissed her on the ear. That reward would never come, though. That night, we went through our nightly routine after dinner. We brushed our teeth, put on our pajamas, and got ready for bed. As I picked up the book and directed him to the loft bed, though, he grabbed my arm and shook his head. I thought he would argue about bedtime. He wasn't a big one for bedtime. Instead, he shook his head and pointed to the bottom bunk. "Can I sleep there?" he asked, pointing at the bunk. I sighed and looked up at the top bunk, wondering how I would get up that tiny little staircase. One look at my son showed me something was seriously going on, though. He looked scared, too scared for a kid his age, and I was kind of scared myself all of a sudden. What was so scary about this bed? This wasn't the first time he'd balked at the idea of sleeping in the loft bed, and I was kind of hesitant to climb into it. I got over that quickly and told him he could sleep on the bottom if he wanted. So we read our Clifford book, I turned out the lights, and swung up into the top bunk as I snuggled down to sleep. For a few hours, I slept fitfully. I was awakened in the dark of the night by a light scratch at the window. It wasn't a loud scraping. It was soft, like something rubbing lightly against the glass as it attempted to get my attention. Maybe a fingernail, maybe a knife tip, but it was consistent in its efforts as it rubbed. After the picture earlier, my mind tried to conjure an image of a baby head with metal spider legs scrabbling at the glass. In my dream, it dug perfect grooves into the window, like a jewel thief's tool in a movie, and it was making progress through the glass. The baby's head had a mouthful of metal teeth to go along with its legs. The teeth gnashed at the glass as the legs cut, and I could do little more than lay there and watch him cut through the transparent barrier. I woke up as he scuttled in, leaping at my face, its twisted metal teeth twinkling. When I woke up, I thought the dream hadn't quite ended. The scraping continued, that soft, whispery sound, and I opened my eyes and glanced at the window. I was covered up, a pillow over my head, and my eyes peeked from beneath the corner of the blanket. I was still half asleep, and as the crust broke away from my eyes, I thought I might still be dreaming. I saw the baby head, metal legs still scrabbling, pressing against the window. I lay still, watching the little creature bounce off the glass. Its scalp was a stubby patch of yanked out hair. Its one blue eye looked straight ahead, placidly, while the other yawned vacantly. The metal legs were bumping and rubbing, making scratching sounds against the glass. They didn't seem as dexterous as they had in my dream. The monster thing seemed like a Halloween decoration, something blown by the wind as it swung from a post. And as I watched it shake and spasm, I noticed the ring from the picture, that thick metal hoop, ran through the head and connected it to a thick chain. I followed the chain, and the outline of a person began to come into view. He was framed perfectly against the privacy bushes in front of the window, his clothes blending seamlessly. He was tall, 6 feet at least, and his body was large and looked strong beneath his sweater. His face was doughy and pockmarked as it pressed against the window glass, his tongue wet and forming bubbles as it slid over the filthy glass. His flesh was pressed against the window as he looked into the shadowy room, his eyes searching for something. Thankfully, my son probably never saw him and had only ever seen the strange baby head necklace. If he had seen this strange face pressed against the window, he would have likely never slept in his bed again. The man's eyes found mine suddenly, his crazed look sobering a little as he realized I was not my son. We locked eyes, and I'm ashamed to say I did not deliver some piercing look that scared him away. In my dazed and fearful state, I was just as scared as my son was every night before he started screaming. We stared at each other for a count of 5 before he broke and ran off into the night. The police just left, taking a complete statement and checking the bushes for evidence. My son is asleep in my bed, my wife having wrapped him in her protective arms. I'm sitting on the edge of the bed and setting this to words while it's still fresh. Tomorrow I'm going to the hardware store. I'll be coming back with wood to board up the window. I don't care if this weirdo ever comes back or not. Before I let my son spend another night in that room, I will make sure no one ever peeks through that.
I pushed the sign into the ground and looked at the kids gathering up the street with thinly veiled satisfaction. "Keep off the dirt," it read. I'd seen the way their eyes gleamed when the truck came to deliver it, deciding on a preemptive strike. A tall pile of fill dirt was irresistible for small children, and I needed as much of the dirt for my project as possible. Having it scattered all over the yard would make that very difficult, and I needed to post signs before the neighborhood rowdies got any ideas. I went back inside then, not wanting to field questions about my dirt. Sitting in my easy chair, pretending to watch TV, I could see them gathering around to look at the sign. They hunkered over their handlebars and looked dubiously at the sign I had stuck in the mountain of dirt in the front yard. The sign was pretty straightforward, but I wouldn't put it past these kids to find a loophole. They knew me as the cool neighbor, the single guy who gave out full-size candy bars on Halloween and sometimes played baseball in the street with them. The guy who drank on his front porch and sometimes let them fish in his canal, if it was okay with their parents, that was. On some things, however, they knew that I was unbending, and it wouldn't do to argue with me. They all looked up when I came out on the front porch and leaned against the rail to look at them. If you're hoping to find a play in the dirt free card somewhere on top of that pile, it ain't happening. Reggie looked up, and his face was still hopeful. "Gee, Mr. McQuinty, that sure is a great-looking pile of dirt you have there." I nodded, keeping my face neutral as I tried not to smile. "Sure is, and it's for filling in gopher holes, so I'll likely need all of it. If there's any left, though, I'll be sure to let you kids know so you can trample it flat for me." They rode off down the road, sitting a little higher on their bikes as they realized they might still get to play in it. I shook my head as I watched them leave. I'd never known anyone to get so excited about a pile of dirt, except maybe for a bunch of kids. Something about all that fresh, powdery dirt just made them go a little bit crazy. As I looked at the 6-foot mound of fine white dirt, I almost felt like jumping on it myself. I went inside to finish my preparations, getting my work clothes on and finding my gloves. I sat in the living room pulling my boots on when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. I glanced up, the afternoon shadows just starting to lengthen, and saw a pair of small figures standing beside the road. I paused in mid-tie, looking up to see 2 small forms looking at the pile of dirt. It looked to be a couple of neighborhood kids, maybe having one last look before getting back to their game. I shook my head. Kids were so predictable. I finished tying my boots and stepped out onto the front porch. "Hey, looking's fine, but I don't want to see anyone in my..." The road was empty. I looked up and down the road. The kids were already playing a game of touch football further down the cul-de-sac. And I picked up my shovel as I thought about how strange that had been. Those 2 must have really been booking it to make it back to their playmates so quickly. As I started scooping dirt, I thought longingly about having that kind of energy. It would certainly make this job a lot easier. I spent the rest of the afternoon filling in gopher holes. It had been a particularly bad season for them, and the dirt was a band-aid solution at best. The gophers would continue to dig up my yard until I invested in a dog or something.
I kept slinging dirt until the sun grew low in the sky, one angry Chuck actually coming up to growl at me before I threw a shovelful of dirt in his face. When it became too dark to see, I thrust my shovel into the pile of dirt and shook the remaining dirt off myself. The kids were finishing up their football game, heading home as the streetlights came on. They all looked longingly at the pile of dirt, but they knew better than to make a play for it while I was standing on the front porch. My cigarette winked on and off as I stood watching the sun go down, and I pitched the end into the dirt as I went inside. I was frying up some hamburgers when I heard the first tremors of laughter from my front yard. Over the sound of popping grease, I could hear the scuttling laughter of children as they played out front. I walked over to the living room window and looked out into the front yard. By the streetlight's ghostly light, I could see them playing on the mound of dirt I had out front. There were two of them, both dressed in dirty jeans and colorful shirts, both having a ball as they capered on my pile of dirt. I was out the door in a matter of seconds, yelling before the door had fully opened. "Hey, just what the hell do you think you're doing? Can't you read? Stay off the..." The streetlights were dim, but even I could see the absence of anybody in my yard. I walked over to the pile, looking around to see if someone was hiding behind it. I saw pretty quickly that wasn't going to be the case. The pile of dirt was hardly 3 feet tall, and a kid would have to get pretty low to hide behind it. I glanced up and down the street, but the only thing moving on the road was an old chip bag pushed by the wind. I looked back at the pile and was shocked to find that I didn't even see any footprints. The wide, low dirt pile still looked fairly pristine, other than my shovel marks, of course. I scratched my head and went back inside. Maybe I'd just been working too hard today. I pulled my fries out of the oven just as they started to burn. I made 2 hamburgers and added them to the pile of french fries. I tipped a beer into a chilled glass and brought both to the table. After shoveling dirt all afternoon, I was tired and ready for a bite. As I lifted the first one from the plate, I heard my stomach grumble as the grease oozed off the meat. I had just taken the first bite when I heard the metal clang of my shovel falling over. I looked up to find those kids playing on my dirt again. I came barreling out the door, my dinner cooling on my plate, as I stormed out to send these kids off. I was becoming frustrated. I'd made it pretty clear that I didn't want people on my pile of dirt. I had been pretty nice about it, posting signs and asking the kids not to mess with it, but it appeared that some of these kids weren't getting it. If I needed to be a bastard to keep these kids off my dirt, I suppose I'd have to be a bastard. I'd barely gotten 2 words out of my mouth, though, before I once again noticed the yard was empty. I was really getting tired of this. I know what I saw, and what I saw was a pair of filthy kids on my pile of dirt. No matter how many times I checked the yard, though, there was never any sign of a trespasser. The strangest part was a distinct lack of footprints, though. The sand was fresh, maybe even a little damp when you got past the top layer. The kids had been jumping on the sand like a trampoline. There should have been footprints, handprints, something. They came back 3 more times that night, but the last is the only one that really stands out. That was the worst of their appearances. They appeared again as I was finishing my dishes, and again as I sat watching TV. I came striding out to holler at them both times, but all I found was an empty yard. This was ridiculous. What the hell was going on here? I know what I saw, but they were always gone the instant I came outside. Nobody could move that fast, especially not a couple of dirty little kids. And what the hell were they doing out after dark? Most of the parents on this block didn't let their kids out after the streetlights came on. Something funny was going on here. The last time I saw them, that night at least, was just before bedtime. I'd thought the pranks were over as time slipped on. It was 11 o'clock, and I was walking through the living room to get something to help me sleep. I was still a little on edge, and I thought that a nightcap might help me calm down a bit. I was coming out of the kitchen with a tumbler of whiskey, the curtains still open on the front yard, when I saw them there. My glass slipped out of my hand as the 2 kids stood crouching on top of my dirt pile. I was speechless for a moment as the angry fire built inside me. I was furious. Who the hell did these kids think they were? They were coming up in the middle of the night, trying to mess with me. But why? I'd made a very simple request. Why were these kids tormenting me? Because I wouldn't let them play on my damn dirt pile? If I had stopped to quell my anger, I might have noticed that something wasn't right with these 2. The night air was cool on my bare chest as I came shambling out of my house like an angry bull.
Who the hell do you think you are? It's almost midnight. Get your asses over here right now. I'm gonna call your parents and let them know what you've been up to. I got a good mind to... They hadn't moved this time, though. They just stood on that mound of dirt like two scrawny scarecrows, glowering at me through the dirt caked over their face. My God, had they been eating the dirt or something? I had thought them filthy, but these kids were downright grimy. They didn't seem at all concerned with me, but I definitely had their full attention. I had come half into the yard when I saw their eyes. They both seemed to have a nasty case of red eye. They stared at me, their eyes seeming to glow somehow, and I suddenly noticed that they cast no shadow in the dim streetlight. They should have. The dirt pile and my shovel cast a long gantry into the falling streetlight, but these two had nothing. I had stopped barely 20 feet from the pair when the larger of the two took a step towards me. When his dirty sneakers gritted against the loose earth, the red piping looked faded beneath all that mud, and I saw the earth draw up over it like a hand. He opened his mouth, trying to say something, but all that came out was wet soil. Sand and mud bubbled out from over his lips, and the dirt that had covered his foot had begun to slide up his leg as well. He fell to his knees, clutching his throat as he coughed up leaves and mud as well. The sand slid over his hands and up his arms. Even as the dirt bound the first boy to the pile by his knees, they both struggled, trying to free themselves from the prison of sand, but their efforts were ultimately in vain. The sand reclaimed them both in a sudden whoosh. In a blink, they were both gone again. I walked backwards, never taking my eyes off that pile, until the door was closed between us. The next day, I set to work early. I wanted that pile of dirt out of my yard before nightfall. I worked diligently, filling in holes and putting dirt to good use. I used it to fill in a few of the potholes in front of my house even. I just wanted as much of it gone as I could manage. I no longer cared how it happened. When the kids came by on their bikes, I told them to leave. They seemed disappointed, but I didn't want them anywhere near that dirt pile. I was filling in an exceptionally large gopher hole when something caught my eye. I had nearly turned back to the pile when something pale and long made me take a second look. At first I thought it was a worm, but the more I looked, the more I thought I knew what it was. I bent down, the shovel hitting the ground woodenly, as I reached down to pick up what I hoped was a bleached piece of wood. It wasn't, though. It was cold, malleable if not unmovable, and crooked like a sea of pale, purpling flesh. The perfectly filthy nail was hardly visible at the tip of the small finger. I went back to the pile and saw the rest of the hand poking out from the bottom, minus the finger I had accidentally amputated. The cops came when I called, and they brought dogs with them as well as the big white forensics van. They excavated the bodies of a 10-year-old boy from the bottom of the dirt pile, his face frozen in a look of terrified disbelief. He was dressed in very dirty, if not very familiar clothes, and his sneakers had that same filthy red piping that I'd seen the night before. When they lifted him free, they found that his hand was intertwined with something else that also came loose. The other boy had been about 8, and the two had died hand in hand, it seemed. The police had wanted to arrest me, or at least bring me in for questioning, but the forensics guys had figured out pretty quick that these kids had been dead for the last month. A quick search determined that they had been on the missing persons roster for about 3 weeks, and their parents had feared they'd been abducted by some pervert. They'd been playing near the sand pits before they'd gone missing, and the coroner would later find dirt and mud in their lungs and mouth. He figured they had been climbing the big sand piles out there, piles just waiting to be scooped into a truck and sold as fill dirt, when one of them had been sucked down by a pocket of air or an empty spot in the pile. His brother had tried to help him and ended up getting pulled down as well. The two had suffocated as they tried to get out and been picked up by the fill dirt as they trucked it to the company I had bought it from. It happens sometimes, the coroner had told me when I'd asked about it a few weeks later. Kids never think about that kind of thing. They just see a big pile of dirt and start climbing. I haven't seen the two since they took the bodies away, and the company I bought it from came and got the rest of it before they gave me a full refund. I hope they find peace wherever they are now. I think, from now on, I'll just hire someone to fill the holes in my yard. I don't ever want to see another pile of dirt for as long.
The job was too good to be true. I understand that now. The message had popped up in my inbox like 1,000 before it. It sat nestled between a "Buy Viagra online" and a "Congratulations, you've just win a free iPad" email. But as I hovered my mouse over it, I found myself intrigued by the tagline. I could usually spot spam messages, even the ones my inbox seems incapable of catching. This one, though, something about it caught my eye. The spelling and grammar were on point, and something about it just screamed attention. I moved my cursor over the box and hovered it over the email. Preparing to break the cardinal rule, I read the title one more time. Mazer Inc. seeking subjects for free at-home testing. I clicked it, and a very official-looking email informed me that I had been randomly selected to take part in a clinical trial. The email detailed the parameters for this test, the time frame for the test, and the payment method for completion of the test. The parameters were basically A. Take the required supplement they sent you with breakfast and dinner. B. Sign on and watch a series of videos every day for 2 hours. They would involve color patterns, pictographs, and several other standard mental tests. And C. You wear the required Mazer Inc. monitor device while I slept so they could monitor my brain activity and the effects of the supplement. For the price they were quoting, it sounded like a great job. I'd have been a fool not to look into it. I looked the company up online first. It's pretty easy to see which companies are scams these days and which are legit. Mazer Inc. was a publicly traded company, and they did a lot of business in pharmaceuticals and healthcare. They had a few squibs in the news about questionable business practices, but who didn't these days? At the end of the day, they looked on the level, so I applied to their email, thinking I'd never hear back from them again. The return email came a few hours later, thanking me for agreeing to the trial and saying they would ship out my initial package and my initial payment the same day. 3 days later, there was a brown cardboard box on my front doorstep from Mazer Inc., the logo stamped prominently across the side of the box. I hadn't expected it so soon, but the extra money was a nice bonus. Most of my work has been from home these days, and the little bit of it that I was getting was barely keeping the lights on and the rent paid. COVID was still making working in an office difficult, and in these troubled times, every little bit helped. I opened the box and found 8 bottles of something called NeuroBoost. They came in standard 120 capsule bottles and looked perfectly normal, just like something you'd buy at CVS. The monitor turned out to be something similar to an Apple Watch. It had a shiny black band and a smart little face that displayed heart rate, blood pressure, and other general health statistics. I slipped it on, but was confused when I didn't see anywhere to charge it. I shrugged, figuring maybe the internal batteries would last a while. There was also a check stapled to a set of instructions telling me how to get onto the Mazer Inc. website so that I could take my daily mandatory testing. For the amount they were paying, it seemed like a pretty sweet deal if all I had to do was watch a few videos and take some pills and watch the movies for 2 hours a day. When I got up the next morning, there was a bright display on the front of the watch reminding me to take my pills and do my training. So I got up and made some breakfast, took my pills, and got ready for my day. The pills were oily and gave me some fairly rancid burps, but they weren't too bad. When the watch reminded me at noon that I needed to take my training for the day, I sat down at my computer and got to it. The videos were mostly a series of color patterns, flashing in quick succession, as well as a series of brain games that had me doing math or solving puzzles. I guess the pills were supposed to boost my cognitive functions, and I wanted to see if it had affected my scores on the games as badly as the text did. If it did, I couldn't tell. And after my mandatory 2 hours, I closed it up and opened my work folder to see if there was anything new from the office. For the next couple of weeks, everything was fine. I took my pills twice a day, did my mandatory testing, and wore my armband religiously. I found that I liked having it on after a while. It was very comfortable, and being able to glance down and look at my vitals was kind of nice. I've never really had the money for fancy tech, so having something that sort of looked like fancy tech was nice. At the time, I would have told you everything was fine for about the first 2 weeks. But after a few days, I began to notice some strange things around my apartment. It was subtle stuff at first. Things moved, items missing that reappeared a few days later, but it was something more subtle than that as well. Sometimes it felt like someone else had been in my apartment. But that was crazy. The chain was always on, the door was always locked, and, at least to my knowledge, I was the only one that had been in my house since about a week before the quarantine. I thought at the time that I was just being neurotic. But now that I look back on it, I'm pretty sure there was more to it than I was picking up on. The first real sign came to me while I was watching the color patterns one day. I'd been taking the pills for about 2 weeks when one day I watched the colors go from quick flashes of green and blue and yellow and saw a picture. It was just for a second, nothing really substantial, but it looked like a street. It wasn't a street that I knew, and it looked as though it had been torn up by something. I didn't get a good look at it. It was only a flash for a second, but I had to double take to see if I had actually seen what I'd seen. I kept a closer eye on them from then on, but I didn't see anything else that day. The program moved on to math problems a few seconds later, but I never quite forgot about that picture for the rest of the day. That's probably why I remembered it later. I was scrolling through Facebook later, just getting ready to drop off, kind of checking it over without really reading anything, when a friend's post jumped out at me. He was ex-military and he was talking about an attack in Kabul that day, talking about how the military needed to do more or something, when the same street appeared in his picture. It had been the site of a bombing, and the street was destroyed, just as I'd seen it earlier. I sat dry-mouthed for a minute, just mulling it over in my head. The longer I did, the more I kind of began to make excuses for it. It was very strange, but I eventually chalked it up to similarities. I hadn't actually seen that particular street. I was just seeing it now and associating it with what I'd seen earlier. There was no way I had seen the site of an attack before it had even happened. It just wasn't the sort of thing that normal people did. I turned my phone off and rolled over, going to sleep as I told myself it had never come up again. The next day, however, I woke up and found that my shoes were missing. It wasn't like they were expensive or anything, just a pair of Walmart New Balances, but it was the fact that they were missing that confused me. I'd set them beside the door 4 days ago when I'd last left the house. There was no reason in the world that they should be gone, but they were. I could still see the mud from the running track on the carpet by the door, the only proof that they'd been there at all. I searched the house, thinking maybe I'd just put them down somewhere and forgotten about it, but they were nowhere to be found. That made me worried, but again, I put it out of my mind. I was just going stir-crazy from the quarantine, that was all. I just needed to get out more. I'd been taking the pills for about a month when I started seeing more pictures. It happened suddenly. One minute I was seeing red and yellow and blue and purple go by, and the next second they were solidifying into pictures. A Walmart somewhere, a Jeep out in the desert, a shoe left on a beach, a bunch of sunflowers, on and on and on. The colors were gone. I never saw them again. From then on, it was just random pictures. I called the number on the back of the bottle after reading it over to see if there were any side effects. After finding the helpline, the one that says to call if you have any adverse reactions, I waited for the robot call to cease and for a person to pick up. To my surprise, someone picked up right away, and I was spared the indignity of wading through the muck. The lady in customer service listened to what I had to say, took down my employee ID, and told me that this was completely normal. She told me that lots of people reported the colors becoming pictures. It was actually very common to get these sort of calls. She said that if it became anything worrisome, to let them know, but seeing the pictures was completely natural. I hung up, feeling a lot better. I kept feeling better until that night. Until I woke up in the middle of my living room with no earthly idea how I'd gotten there. I had my hand wrapped around the doorknob, and I was fully dressed in jeans and a t-shirt. I was wearing a pair of black boots that I didn't recognize, and I had my car keys in my hand. I'd clearly been going somewhere, but I had no memory of deciding to leave. I'd been getting ready for bed the last I remembered, easing under the covers and just getting snug down for the evening. I remembered falling asleep, though I clearly didn't remember waking back up. I sat up for the rest of the night, a cup of coffee in hand to make sure that I didn't try to slip off and sleepwalk somewhere. I had never had a history of sleepwalking, but I'd heard that people could pick it up later in life. Sleep dressing yourself and sleep driving were something I'd never heard of, but I suppose anything was possible. That day I went out and bought a stopper to put under the door. I bought a flipper lock and installed it myself.
I would have put a second deadbolt on as well if I hadn't rented the apartment. I thought if I made it more difficult for myself to leave, I might not sleepwalk outside. If I wanted to blunder around my apartment, that was one thing. Going out with no memory of the outside was another, especially if I'd been intending to drive. I had been taking the pills for about 2 months at this point, but I never equated them to what was going on. I think maybe I just didn't want to. I liked the way they made me feel, and I especially liked the extra money I was getting every month for taking them. Some of the pictures I'd been seeing had come up again. The shoe on the beach had turned out to be a little card from a plane crash over Spain. The Walmart had been celebrating its 20-year anniversary when someone had driven a car through the festivities. I had stopped really looking for them anywhere. I didn't really want to know what they were. I had my own problems to worry about. I'd woken up several times since the first night, standing in different rooms and having no clue how I'd gotten there. I woke up in the kitchen, toast burning in the toaster. I shook awake in the shower, fully clothed as the water fell over me. I came to on the floor of my living room with my legs under the couch, and I awoke several times as I fumbled at the lock on my apartment. Whatever was happening to me, my body seemed to be trying to keep me from hurting myself, and for that I was pretty grateful. I think my body knew the pills were doing something strange to me, but my brain was trying its best to justify the actions. It seemed like my brain might be keeping secrets from the rest of us, secrets that I would find out pretty soon. Then one day, I woke up somewhere different. I woke up as I was standing in a factory, preparing to break a tank full of cloudy liquid with a fire axe. I dropped the axe that I'd been preparing to shatter the glass with and looked around in confusion. Where the hell was I? How had I gotten here? I looked around and could see other people causing general destruction as well, but they didn't seem to have come to like I had. They were destroying lab equipment, factory equipment, and anything else they could get their hands on. They were like a group of mindless ants, swarming over everything they couldn't destroy themselves and wrecking it with sheer numbers. I didn't understand what was going on, but I knew I had to get the hell out of there. No one came to stop me as I ran, so I took off and didn't stop running till I was outside. Turned out I was actually somewhere I knew. I'd been inside the Terminus Chemical Building. I'd seen the building many times from the freeway, but I'd never actually been inside it. I had a vague idea of what they did, medical research or chemical trials or something, but I couldn't have told you why I'd been there destroying things. I started moving, making my way for the freeway, and when I got there I managed to thumb a ride and get back to the general vicinity of my apartment. It was the middle of the night when I got out of the building, and the sun was just starting to get up when I got home. For the next 3 days I stayed inside and strapped myself into bed every night. I stopped taking the pills and stopped logging onto the website for my daily training. It appeared that I might have lost my monitor while I was busily destroying the factory, but I was honestly glad to have it off me. My phone rang a few times from unlisted phone numbers, but I never picked them up. I was done taking their drugs and being their guinea pig, if that's all I was. On the third day, someone knocked on the door. After a few minutes of peeking through the peephole, I opened it slowly and glanced mousily through the crack. The monitor was on the front mat, sitting like a bomb on the rough fibers. On top was a note, my name written on the back of a folded Polaroid. I reached for it, not wanting it, but needing to see it. The picture was no grainy Polaroid, but a highly detailed photo of me as I smashed a tank of cloudy liquid with the axe I'd swung that night. On the picture was a little caption that read, "Can you see any colors in this picture? Take your pills, do your training, put on your monitor, and get back to work, lest we send this picture to the police and let them know what you've been up to on your nightly excursions."